Hi everyone, Helen Blunden here. Hope you're happy, healthy and well. It is time for a new video today where I share some life lessons out of books that I have been reading. And this particular one, Anita Brookner, was written in 1982 and it is called Providence. Now, I found this book at the City Basement bookstore, which is a great bookstore in Melbourne. If you ever come to this city, go and visit City Basement Books, which is underground, and you can find a whole heap of used secondhand books down there. You could spend hours down in that basement and go through the stacks of books and the books on shelves and the books on the floor to find some real gems. I found a whole heap of Anita Brookner novels, of which I bought a few, not all of them, simply because I've got something to share here a little bit later on as to the reason why. But when I found this book, it was in pristine condition. For a book that was written in 1982, although this one was published in 1991, I believe, it was never used. The spine wasn't cracked. It was as if I had bought it new, and so that was one of the reasons I bought it. Providence is about Kitty Maule, who is a 30-year-old woman who teaches the romantic traditions in literature at a university, and she's going really well in her job. In fact, all the other lecturers love her, her students love her as well. She is a gem. She has everything right going for her professionally. However, she's in love with Maurice, who is also someone in the similar field to her, but he's a bit standoffish and she can't understand why she can't get close to him. He seems to use her whenever he has the need, and yet somehow she cannot connect with him, she cannot get in contact with him. And one day he says to her, I'm going to go on a trip around France to go and visit the cathedrals because that's what he does. And she wrongly believes that he's going to ask her to come along, which he didn't, of course. And so she never gets this feeling of closeness, and yet she still loves him. And she too then also travels to France to try and find him and does her own studies in France. But always, whenever they do connect, there's always something there that's not quite right. He either wants to leave a lot earlier, or she wants to spend more time with him and he doesn't. Now, for us readers, we're seeing the alarm bells. We know that we possibly even have been in very similar situations in our lives and having people like Maurice in our lives. But for Kitty, she is a little bit naive and she is a hopeless romantic. And around her, she sees evidence of failed women in her eyes. She's got Carol, who is a divorcee, who's a neighbour of hers, and she feels that Carol somehow overdoes things. She tries too hard to get a man, and she doesn't want to be like Carol. She doesn't want to feel desperation coming from her. At the same time though, Kitty has a backstory. Her mother was in love with John Maule, who was in the army and who was subsequently killed, and this devastated her mother, and so Kitty basically grew up with her grandparents. And her grandparents were dressmakers, and they were dressmakers of Paris in the 1950s, so they made dresses like those haute couture dresses, those big numbers, and they were quite well off and quite famous in Paris. Her grandfather Vadim was Russian, and he lovingly helped his wife Louise make these beautiful gowns. But in their older years, in their 90s now, they lived in their own apartments, in their own heads, and also kind of recounted their own history. So they lived in their past, but they saw that Kitty needed to have someone in her life so she too could move on. She lived in an apartment by herself, and even though she enjoyed living in the apartment by herself, she always wanted someone to share it with, and she assumed Maurice would be the one. So with Anita Brookner's novels, I have started to think now that I've done this video simply because I have also done some other novels on this YouTube channel, and I didn't feel right by not sharing my own thoughts about this book, but not only just the book, but in Anita Brookner's writing as well. And one of the conclusions that I have come up with was, given that I have read Anita Brookner novels this year, mainly this year, I think I'm getting to the point where I am beginning to get tired of them, dare I say it, even though I love how she writes and I love the theme and the subject of what she writes. I believe if I had read Brookner in my 30s, I would have been depressed. I would have been depressed simply because a lot of her characters, I feel for her characters, and I think I feel that way simply because in my 30s I felt the same way as her characters, and I felt as if also that I came from an environment where people were always thinking about the past, or thinking about the glory days, or thinking how things could be better, and putting our, I guess, all our hopes and dreams into other people providing something for us. So I kind of got what she was on about. But now in my 50s, and given that I have read a lot of her books, they are all along very similar lines. It's always a permutation or a combination of a young woman, or very rarely a man, with a relationship with their parents or with their grandparents. One of their parents or grandparents are somehow living in the past. The young woman always pins their hopes on someone else, namely a man, and that woman may or may not find a way out, or they might not, okay, of their own situation. So there's a permutation, a combination of the same theme, and they're all about the same size book, kind of like a novella. They're all written beautifully, but the subject is all in a very similar line. And I think I have just been getting a little bit tired reading the same kind of book all the time in close proximity to each other, as in I should have just read a Brookner book once every 6 months, once every 8 months or so, just to kind of get into the storyline, as opposed to reading them all in the one hit and then getting confused because they are all melding into one. So that is my life lesson for the Anita Brookner books. I would say if you don't get tired of her writing, then sure, read her books. But if you want to actually savor her writing and savor the stories, and then discern each story to keep it as its own individual story in your mind, then I would say break them up and read them at longer intervals to each other, because you would appreciate them more. I found Providence very similar to Hotel Du Lac. If you were to ask me, well, what's your favorite Anita Brookner book now, I have to really sit and think as to all her books that I've read and which ones stand out. And the only one that stands out is Hotel Du Lac. And the reason it stands out is because it was my very first book that I read of hers. So I guess my life lesson here is, if you do have author that you love to read, but this author writes very similar genre books and very similar themes that slightly tweak from each other, then kind of break them up and read them with longer intervals, so that you can savor the writing, you can savor the story, you can savor the plot as well, and each character then that comes in the book stands on their own. So that is it for me right now. Thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Bye for now.